Hi everyone, my name is Renee, Program Officer with EcoSchools Canada. On behalf of EcoSchools, thank you for viewing this webinar as part of the 2023 EcoSummit. I'm pleased to introduce Ian Shanahan from Green Teacher to present this webinar teaching kids and teens about climate change. Ian Shanahan's combined passions of nature, education, art, writing, editing, and storytelling have led him to Green Teacher, where he became the general editor in 2018. This role has gradually expanded to include webinar hosting, podcast co-hosting, and the facilitating of PD sessions on climate change and biodiversity education. Across 13 seasons with Ontario Parks, Ian worked as a naturalist at Presqu'île for 8 years, a species at-risk surveyor at Charleston Lake for 1 year, and a naturalist at Algonquin for 4 years, the last of which was spent backfilling as the coordinator of Algonquin's renowned interpretive program. Concurrently, he completed his BAH at Queen's University and then his B.Ed at the University of Toronto before becoming an Ontario certified teacher. Off the corner of his desk, Ian works as a voice actor, nature artist, writer, environmental consultant, and nature guide. Be sure to check out the accompanying worksheets for this webinar, which can be found linked in the description below and in the presentation schedule at ecoschools.ca/EcoSummit. We would also like to acknowledge that the EcoSummit has been made possible with support from Natural Resources Canada. We're glad to have you join us for this presentation, and now I will pass it over to Ian.
All right, thank you so much, Renee. And it is an absolute honor to be here representing Green Teacher. We're a charitable nonprofit based here in Canada. And my presentation today, as you can see, is teaching kids and teens about climate change. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. This is Williams Treaty Territory, also known as Southeastern Ontario, the North Shore of Lake Ontario. So we're near big water, even if it isn't actually the ocean. Sometimes I just pretend it is. So my background in environmental education, or how I cut my teeth in this field, was through nature interpretation, which is still a great passion of mine. This is me at Algonquin Park, doing some outdoor experiential education. And my interest, both personally and professionally, in environmental education has expanded to the realm of climate change communication. And that has resulted in me reading many books, a good number of which are listed right here. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of the wonderful books about climate science, climate solutions, climate change communication. But I do recommend all of these titles here, as they have certainly informed my practice and just my outlook as we work towards this transition to a clean energy economy. And one of the big questions that has arisen for me in the process of reading these books and studying about this topic is this question here. And it's become one of my favorite questions, and a very inspiring and empowering question. What if we get it right? What if we make the right decisions in terms of policy toward decarbonization and building this clean energy economy? What does that world look like? And I think this speaks to the power of storytelling and being vivid about how we describe what could be waiting for us and what is still possible for us on the other side of this transition. And the power of storytelling is something that author Per Espen Stoknes touches on in his book about climate communication. It's titled What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, a bit of a clunky title, but a very insightful book. This quotation in particular really stood out for me because it speaks to the necessity of storytelling in engaging people's emotions, because let's face it, humans are complex emotional beings. And if we stick strictly with the rational brain, we're missing the opportunity to really engage with people. So I'll let you just read through that to get a general gist of the advice here. But overall, it's all about being vivid about how we describe this future that we want. But because if we don't know what we are aiming towards, it's very difficult to build a plan to help us get there. We touch on engaging students both emotionally and rationally with climate action, with climate solutions, and just learning about climate science with our two books, Teaching Kids and Teaching Teens About Climate Change. I can't take any credit for these books. My predecessor, Tim Grant, was the main mover and shaker behind putting these books together. And each book really serves as a toolkit for educators in various educational contexts who want to teach about climate change. And I will be sharing some activities from these books in our time together today to give you a sense of some possibilities that you might try in your educational practice. Tim has laid out a framework for first understanding climate science, and that framework is outlined in both of these books. It's looking at it through 4 different lenses: global warming, climatic instability, consequences of global warming, and climatic flip or tipping points, which is something that we hear a lot about. Once we get to a certain temperature level, that might flip us into an entirely different climate, setting off various feedback loops. We certainly don't want to get to that place. The good news is it looks like the worst case scenarios are off the table because there has been a lot of momentum as we move through the energy transition. Some of these activities are taken from Green Teacher's subscription-based resource portal. One of the newer activities specifically related to effective climate change education is this one here, Essentials for Teaching Climate Change, which was published in 2019 by Seth Wines, who is a researcher at the University of British Columbia. He did a study in 2019 with fellow researcher Kim Nicholas, and you can just see this little list that they came up with to really simplify our basic understanding of climate change. So 1, the Earth is warming. 2, it's bad. 3, it's because of us. It's because of humans. 4, experts agree. And I think most importantly, we can fix it. And it's the we can fix it that is so important for educators to focus on when they're teaching about climate change. In shorthand, we can fix it is just focusing on solutions or taking what is known as a solutionary approach to climate change education. And fortunately, you don't have to look very far to find some wonderful and inspiring resources focused on climate solutions. There's 2 books by Paul Hawken. This one came out in 2021. It's Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. There's his earlier book from 2017, Drawdown, that lists 100 climate solutions that are either in action now or on the cusp of being in action. And another read, this came out last year in 2022. This was written by climate journalist Chris Turner. It's How to Be a Climate Optimist. And he touches on taking this solutions-oriented approach and some of the effective language for talking about climate change. For example, rather than talking about decarbonization, which has sort of a negative connotation, making something less bad, let's focus on making a clean energy economy that has so many other benefits. One really obvious one being that it'll be a lot quieter. Imagine all the vehicles are electric in 30 years. You won't have that rumble of traffic. That will make our cities much more livable. So there are lots of other benefits that we can focus on. And as I say, you don't have to go far to look for reasons to be very realistically optimistic. Now, nothing is entirely easy or straightforward. There are pitfalls to avoid. And one of the big pitfalls is something known as techno-optimism. And that's the idea that we can essentially stick with the status quo and just tech our way out of any problems. And it's an intriguing idea because it is based in some truth. Technologies, for example, like carbon capture, utilization, and storage will absolutely play a role, and in some local areas, a very important role in our path toward building a clean energy economy. However, it's not an excuse to strictly continue with the status quo and just assume that we can sit back, relax, and let technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage sort of bail us out of the challenges that will come down the road. A lot of the tactics for preserving the status quo are documented very, very well in Dr. Michael Mann's 2021 book, The New Climate War. One of the big focus areas of this book is the fact that denialism has, for the most part, flown the coop. I mean, there are still some hardcore denialists out there, but they tend to be louder than they are numerous. Denialism has essentially been replaced, according to Michael Mann, by a series of additional D words. Disinformation, we certainly see a lot of that in today's You could almost call it the age of disinformation, where there's just so much of it floating around and coming at people from so many different directions. Deflection, and we'll touch on this in a bit more detail in a few moments. Delayism, I just touched on this with the concept of techno-optimism, thinking that we can delay action because we can rely on these magical technologies to bail ourselves out. And also doomism, this idea that we're already past the point of no return and we should just give up and sort of take a party till midnight attitude. And really all of these D words, as well as this additional one, Michael Mann doesn't specifically touch on it in the book, but it's another useful one that we do see a lot of out there, is downplaying, just saying, yes, climate change is happening, but it's not that big of a deal. All 5 of these D words are very much present in today's world, and they can lead to yet another D word, despair. And what we as educators have the opportunity to do in leading explorations with our students of pathways to action, we can turn that despair into empowerment. And I'm going to share with you some activities that might help you do just that. As I mentioned before, some of these activities, or actually all of these activities, are derived from Green Teachers books. These 2 that I will share with you right now are from Teaching Teens About Climate Change, so more for middle and high school students. This first activity is called Teaching About Carbon Regulation, and this gets people thinking about actual regulatory frameworks that are in place in various jurisdictions right now, and looking at what are the impacts of those regulatory frameworks on individuals and organizations. So it's very much based in reality, this activity. 3 regulatory frameworks that are in action right now. There's command and control, so a very top-down approach, which is, I think for most people, they would see this as the last resort. We don't want to have this super top-down approach where the rules are so stringent that we don't have the freedom to live our lives the way we wish to. The next 2, carbon tax and cap and trade, are very much in play. And we're seeing a lot of success with these 2 regulatory frameworks. In Canada, we have a carbon tax. In jurisdictions like California that are leaders in decarbonization and building a clean energy economy, they've had great success in lowering their greenhouse gas emissions with a cap and trade system. So this whole activity is based on looking at the impacts of these 3 different systems, specifically on organizations. And the way you can set it up is your teacher can be the quote unquote North American Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or you can come up with some other fancy name for the leader, the teacher. You'll have 2 maybe 3 students become your carbon brokers. They can be your numbers people to look at the economic impacts of these 3 frameworks, as well as the impacts on atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. And then the remainder of your class, the remainder of your students, will be grouped into clusters of 2 to 5, and each group will represent a coal-powered utility company. And these will be based on real or realistic companies that are already out there in the world. And each group will get an information sheet about their company with information about their operations, their costs, their greenhouse gas emissions, just kind of everything you need to know about that company. And as you go through the activity and simulate each of the 3 different regulatory frameworks, you look at and quantify what would be the economic impact and greenhouse gas impact of that framework on this company. How would your company be impacted by command and control? How would it be impacted by the carbon tax and cap and trade, particularly with the cap and trade simulation? You can get those 2 or 3 students who are the carbon brokers to help with the number crunching. And this is a great activity because it gives you real data that you can use to inform decisions. Now, of course, this is all theoretical, but you can make this more place-based and local by using examples from your jurisdiction. So I'm based in Ontario. If you're based in Ontario, look at actual utilities companies in your province or state, wherever you happen to be based, and use those as the 6 or so companies that you use as the examples of companies that are impacted by these 3 regulatory frameworks. This activity is so effective because it combines solutions, so these regulatory frameworks for decarbonization. You can make it local if you connect it with organizations in your jurisdiction, and it introduces pathways to action. And this combination of these three factors can powerfully lead to that empowerment that is so key for students and really for everybody who wants to see what they could do to contribute to our path toward this clean energy economy. Again, though, nothing is ever so simple, and this is yet another pitfall that you will want to tiptoe around, this idea of deflecting to individuals. So taking action is great, and empowering students and leading them in inquiry-based investigations of pathways towards solutions is fantastic. But we do have to be mindful of not strictly deflecting to smaller scale individual actions like switching to LED lights. Now, that's not to say that switching to LED lights and other small scale actions are unimportant. They can be very important. They can have an impact, but not enough of an impact to really move the needle as much as we need it to. So we don't want educators or students to feel bad about taking these individual actions. We just have to, alongside those individual actions, look at actions that can be scaled up at a community level. This gets back to those D words and deflection. And Michael Mann really devotes quite a lot of time in this book to talking about some of the more insidious ways that various vested interests have engaged in deflection to get people thinking about their own choices as opposed to community and other collective actions. The high impact actions are the ones that we really need as we build this clean energy economy. These include switching our power grid to one that is powered by renewables. Now, that's a pretty lofty action for a school or a class to take on, but there are some realistic actions that you can take at a school level that can be scaled up beyond the school. And one such activity is detailed in this lesson, Going Off Ramp, a car trip reduction plan for schools. The activity starts with a survey that you can do with your class to get a sense of their transportation habits. And that is followed up with coming up with a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the class's carbon habits. So that might be something like designating a walking school bus day. Maybe every Wednesday or each week, Wednesday is walking school bus day, where people walk in groups together to school. Or maybe you have no car Friday. There are lots of different ways you can go with this. But what's really neat about this activity is you can do it within a class. You can then scale it up to different classes within your school, maybe a friendly competition, maybe scale it up even further to different schools within your board, and maybe it goes even further than that. It's these scalable community actions that can really empower students and let them see that there are pathways to taking action. Now, I should say that the purpose of learning about climate change and climate action is not to create activists, but by exploring these pathways to actions, students who are so inclined to get involved have fewer barriers to getting involved. The next question, though, is what about teaching climate change to kids? And a lot of this comes down to reaching them where they're at, meeting them where they're at, which often has to do with no tragedies before fourth grade, which is a wonderful quote from outdoor educator David Sobel, he of the book Place-Based Education that I'm sure many eco-schools educators are quite familiar with. And I think this is really important for us to keep in mind. There's a lot you can learn about with regards to climate change, climate science, that isn't connected to natural disasters or disasters provoked by climate change. This is also not to say that you immediately after fourth grade switch into talking about disasters. You always want to keep that empowerment and the solutions focus there. But in the younger grades, there's no reason why you can't focus on the wonders of nature. And something like the carbon cycle is actually quite a fascinating topic to explore, one that you can explore and create a lot of positive associations in the process. This activity, Caught Up in the Carbon Cycle, written by Pamela Miller from the Toronto District School Board, is a wonderful activity for creating those positive associations alongside the learning that happens in the course of this very hands-on, very active activity that is best done outdoors. It can be done indoors, but it's probably most effective if done outdoors. It's from our book, Teaching Kids About Climate Change. And just to do a quick overview of the instructions, you have preset action cards at each of 7 stations. So you can do this in your schoolyard. Each individual student or each learner takes on the role of a carbon molecule, and they are going to go on a wonderful journey and chart that journey as they go. Always useful to review relevant vocabulary like combustion, decomposition, diffusion, etc. You will then give each student a passport, so a sheet to record their journey as they cycle throughout the carbon cycle. And then the students start traveling. They travel to the different stations. At each station, they pick up an action card that tells them what to do next and where to go next. This is the example of the passport card where they chart their journey, and these are the different stations. So there's the animal station, the atmosphere station, combustion, plants, rock cycle, soils, and water. It's very easy to make this activity especially place-based. So for example, the animal cycle could be the crows or the ring-billed gulls that are frequent on your schoolyard. The plant station could be a specific tree or flower on your schoolyard. The soil station can be just the soil beneath your feet. So you can make it very local and place-based and thereby more relevant. Continuing with this idea of creating positive associations with learning about the carbon cycle or other aspects of climate science with learners at a young age, we have this activity, the carbon dioxide game by Sashi Kaufman. The instructions for this game involve drawing 2 concentric circles, so one small circle about 1 meter in diameter, and then around that one, a larger circle that's about 5 meters in diameter. The inner circle represents the sun, and the outer circle represents the limits of the atmosphere. You will then have 2 static CO2 molecules and many sunbeams, and these CO2 molecules and sunbeams will all be represented by your students. The sunbeam students must tag the Earth, so they go into the circle, tag the Earth, so the smaller circle inside, and then they have to run out and escape the atmosphere without getting tagged by the 2 CO2 molecule students. Any tagged sunbeams have to freeze in the atmosphere. So this is a really great demonstration of the science of the greenhouse effect. You can also, in the process of this game, draw what did humans do cards. And here are some examples. So humans drive cars, so you might add 2 CO2 molecule students. So then instead of just 2 CO2 molecule students in the atmosphere, you have 4. And as you can see with the rest of these cards, the number of CO2 molecules inside your atmosphere can increase quite quickly. Now you can also remove CO2 molecules. So for example, humans ride bikes, so they're not putting as much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. You can take away some CO2 molecules. I do want to mention there's a great opportunity for learning about offsets with this activity, and one such offset is planting trees. Now, maybe for somewhat older students, grade 4, 5, 6, 7, you can talk about the idea that carbon offsetting can be wonderful in some ways, but it can be an example of greenwashing in other ways. So for example, planting trees that were already going to be planted isn't really offsetting carbon emissions. And this is a concept that's explored in great detail in this book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success by Mark Jackert, a Canadian economist based out of Simon Fraser University. So there are lots of extension opportunities with this activity. But overall, you're learning about the greenhouse gas, or you're learning about the greenhouse effect and having fun while you're doing it, getting physical, getting active while you're doing it, and creating these all-important positive associations. I know that's a bit of a rapid-fire introduction to some of the effective approaches to teaching kids and teens about climate change. So just to review, keeping it local and place-based makes it real and relevant, making it action-oriented and opening up to your learners pathways for potentially taking action, specifically community-based action as opposed to individual action. Both of those are important. Keeping that solutions focus is important, and making sure that you're engaging students emotionally. Create those positive associations, tell vivid stories, imagine the future that could be waiting for us on the other side of this energy transition. And you may have great success in taking your students from a place of despair to a place of empowerment. And I want to leave you with one final idea before we finish off here on this idea of focusing on solutions. In episode 15 of Green Teachers podcast, Talking with Green Teachers, which is available freely on all of the usual podcast platforms, we talked with this gentleman here, Samuel Levac-Levy, who's a young entrepreneur who really wanted to take climate action that could be high impact and really inspire young people in particular. And he actually created a board game based on Project Drawdown, which charts and documents and quantifies the impacts of 100 climate solutions. We talked to Sam in episode 15 of our podcast, where we do touch on climate change education quite a lot. So I invite you to tune into that episode. Again, it's totally free. It's on all the regular platforms. And it's a nice reminder that a lot of really passionate, innovative, and compassionate people are on the case, and that there is great reason for hope. We're not out of the woods yet, but we do have reasons for hope grounded in reality. And I thank you for joining me on this journey today of taking our students from despair to empowerment, because we can do it and we don't have to look far to find it. So thank you very much. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out. My email is ian@greenteacher.com, and you can learn more about Green Teacher at www.greenteacher.com. So I wish you all the best in your endeavors in teaching climate change to kids and teens. It can be a really enriching and at times fun endeavor. So best of luck. Thank you so much.